Episode 2 of the Continental is here, and manages to be a slight improvement upon the first episode, though it is still plagued by issues that manage to hold this series back. This episode shows us the process of Winston putting together an army to fight back against the Continental and finally take down Cormac. However, it doesn't feel like this show goes about executing that premise very well. I mean, they're going up against Cormac, who knows who they are, and yet Winston is able to just freely walk around the city without any real consequences or encountering any real danger. Cormac has the entire power of the Continental at his disposal, yet he doesn't really use it to go after Winston. So it makes this episode sort of come off as Cormac not even trying. We don't really get any assassination attempts on Winston or his friends, and they're just sort of allowed to do whatever they please without any consequences. You'd think that with Cormac being in the position that he is in, he would be putting everything at his disposal to try and capture Winston. Yet that didn't seem to be the case in this episode. It seems like in this episode, Cormac is mostly using his goons to search for the coin press at the various locations we saw our heroes at in the previous episode. And because of this, it doesn't really feel like Winston and his friends are ever in danger of being discovered by Cormac, because, they're not looking for him. Because of that, it leaves this episode without a lot of tension, since Cormac's men are too busy looking for a MacGuffin rather than trying to hunt down our protagonists. You would also think that Cormac would be using more than just Hansel and Gretel, who we saw in the first episode, to try and track down Winston and the coin press, but that's not the case, as it's only those two and a couple nameless goons who seem to be actively searching for the coin press. It gives this episode a feeling that Cormac isn't really trying, despite being on a 3-day deadline before the High Table decides to kill him and replace him. The John Wick films show us just how much power some of these groups hold, and you'd think that Cormac would be using all of it at his disposal to try and hunt down Winston. Instead, we only see him send 3 cars after Winston, who are disposed of in mere seconds. I would have liked if this episode had more of a cat-and-mouse approach to it, with Winston having to sneak through New York to try and assemble his allies, rather than just being able to freely move however he pleases. Other than that, there are only a couple minor inconsistencies that bothered me about this episode, such as how Frankie's wife, Yen, who in the previous episode was established to not understand English, is able to understand it perfectly in this episode. And then you have the one small nitpick that has really been bugging me with this series, which is the vast overuse of licensed music in this series. Basically, every transition between scenes is accompanied by some popular song from the 70s, which really doesn't fit the musical style of the John Wick universe, and it just comes off as really lazy. I can get doing this a couple times, but every single transition in each episode is a bit much. And for me at least, it has started to become very immersion breaking. The John Wick series was never really known for its use of licensed music, so seeing it featured so heavily here is really distracting. It honestly gives the impression that this series just didn't have any better way to transition between scenes, so they just fall back upon playing a licensed song in between every scene transition. It almost gives the impression that you're listening to a 70s mixtape while watching this series, which isn't really something that you would associate with John Wick. Though that is really just a minor nitpick on my part, and likely won't bother other people as much, though once you start to notice it, I find it something that's almost impossible to ignore. But getting back on track now, I do feel like this episode was an improvement upon the first one. While it is definitely lacking in the action department, I felt like it actually took its time to try and develop these characters, even if I don't really care about them still. There is at least an attempt to get you to care. We get to see flashbacks explaining Frankie's connection to some of these other characters, and finally understand what caused him and Winston to grow apart. And while I do feel like these flashbacks are a little too late to get me invested in any of the cast, there is at least the sense that they were trying to do something with these characters. At the very least, I can say this episode didn't feel like it was just dragging on like the first episode was. While there were a few great moments in this episode, I felt they were rather predictable, like the scenes involving Cormac, or they lacked any sort of tension, like with what happens with Winston. The big thing that this episode leaves you off on is with Winston's confrontation with Sharon, and hoping that he will side with Winston and not Cormac. And while I felt like the scene where Winston basically abducts Sharon and tries to convince him to join his side was very well done, it also lacked any sense of tension because we know what happens in John Wick and which side Sharon will choose. And with this episode ending on the cliffhanger of Sharon having to choose between Winston and Cormac, it kind of takes away any tension you have going into the final episode. And so going into this final episode, we're just sort of left with this feeling of inevitability. No matter what Cormac does, we already know that Winston comes out on top, and it's already fairly obvious that it will be in large part due to Sharon's betrayal of Cormac. There's no real tension on if Sharon's going to betray him, it's just a matter of when and how. And so that leaves any tension being with the survival of the side characters introduced in this series, and it honestly hasn't done enough to make me care about any of them. I'm sure that from the start of the series, a lot of people already considered them expendable, because let's be honest, if you're a named character in a prequel who wasn't featured in the original series, then it's likely you're not going to make it through to the end, which means that the audience will likely already be fairly apathetic towards these characters unless you do a really good job of making people actually care about them, which this series honestly hasn't done a very good job of. And so that leaves me going into this final episode of the Continental just sort of waiting for it to be over with. We already know the outcome of this final confrontation, so all that's really left is to see how good the action will be. It's clear that the people in charge of this show didn't really have a good story in mind when producing it, and that all they really cared about was using the John Wick name to bring in views. So at the very least, I hope we can get some good action scenes out of it in the final episode coming up, because at this point, I'm not really expecting the story to pick up in the final episode. And that about wraps up my thoughts on this second episode of The Continental. Are you enjoying this deeper look into the John Wick universe, or are you more like me and just ready for things to start wrapping up? Let me know in the comments, and until next time, thanks for watching.